morning. Good morning. Thank you. Welcome, everybody, to Lake Charles, Louisiana. I think I was on the bench, for just a couple of weeks. In those days when you started out as a brand new judge, you began trying these sort of low-level small claims cases. You know, the dry cleaner ruined my dress, but he also tried to pick up my sister. So, guy says to me, Your Honor, my client doesn't speak English and we need a translator. What's the language? The language is Italian. Well, I called the courthouse administrator to find the translator in the building. She was in another courtroom. So I said to the throngs, there's this many people in the courtroom. Is there anybody here that speaks Italian and can do this translation? Little guy in the back raises his hand. He comes up. We swear him in to translate truthfully and accurately. And here's literally what happens. Lawyer to translator. Give the court your name. Translator to witness. What is your name? I thought, let me see where this is going to go. Lawyer to translator, tell the court your address. Translator to witness, where is your house? I looked at this guy, I said, I thought you told me that you could speak Italian. He said, I can, Your Honor, but my English, she's not too good. One time I was picking a jury in a drug distribution case in New Jersey. The judge actually picks the jury. So the judge interrogates a large number of people like this, from which to extract 12 people that have no bias, no interest, no knowledge of the case, no concern for the outcome, and can fairly try the case. I sensed that there were some people in this room that didn't want to be on the jury. So I said, is there anybody here that can't serve in this jury? Little lady in the back raises her hand. I said, yes, madam, what is it? She said, I can't be on this jury because of my occupation. I thought, oh, this is a drug distribution case. What does this lady do? So I said, all right, madam, what do you do? She said, I'm a soothsayer. Come on, who calls himself a soothsayer in 1995? I fell for this. I said, all right, how does that prevent you from being on this jury? She said, Judge, I already know how the case ends up. I should have said, tell us, lady, and save us the next 3 weeks in the courtroom. I have not hesitated in my work at Fox, even though it's to the ire of some of my colleagues, to be critical of Republican administrations as well as Democratic administrations when, in my view, they exceed the confines of the Constitution and do things that the government is not authorized to do. But in a small and relatively unknown way, I am responsible for the administration of George W. Bush. Now, I'm going to take you back to November of 2000 during the recount. In those days, all vacations, all time offs, all weekends were canceled. We all worked 42 days straight, about 17 hours a day at Fox. And as the chief legal on-air person, I had to become an expert in, you remember this, Florida election law and hanging chads and dimpled chads and all that stuff. One night, I'm on air with my colleague Britt Hume. He's in Washington, I'm in New York. Through the magic of television, it looks like we're together in the same room. And we were discussing an issue involving the litigation in Florida. At that time, there were lawsuits in 4 different counties in Florida, 2 by Al Gore and 2 by George Bush. And Fox did one of those things that it does about 25 or 30 times every half hour, one of those swoosh Fox alerts. So the swoosh Fox alert comes in, and Britt starts to read from the teleprompter and is basically saying the Florida Supreme Court has just ordered that the recount resume in all 64 counties of the state of Florida, not just the 4 counties in which the litigation has been going on. And the Bush people plan to appeal this decision to the United States Court of Appeals for the 11th Circuit. He then looks at me and says, Judge, what do you think about this? And I said, well, without getting too much into the weeds, a federal appeals court, the United States Court of Appeals for the 11th Circuit, does not have jurisdiction to hear an appeal from the Florida Supreme Court. He said to me, well, what should Bush's people do? I said, they should get into their cars and go to Georgetown. I looked at my watch. It's 5 minutes to 7 at night. The courts are closed. He said, what will they do in Georgetown? I said, they should look for the home of Justice Anthony Kennedy, who is the circuit justice for the 11th Circuit for the southeast portion of the United States. They can file an emergency appeal, knock on the door and file an emergency appeal with Justice Kennedy. If he takes the appeal, that will stop the effect of the decision of the Supreme Court of Florida, and then the next day, the clerk of the Supreme Court will poll the other 8 justices to see if they want to take the case. At that point, it's 7 o'clock and Brit Hume's show is over, and I go to my office to take a nap for a couple of hours, in part because I've been on air for about 36 hours straight, in part because at 10 o'clock I'm on with O'Reilly. And of course, you need all the rest you can get for an experience like that. While I am sound asleep on a couch in my office, the following occurs. Shepard Smith, charming, garrulous, never one to miss a beat colleague of mine, is on about 15 minutes after 7. Another one of those Fox swooshes. And the swoosh alert is the following. Governor Bush's lawyers have just been cited in their cars in Georgetown, looking for the private residence of Justice Anthony Kennedy. And he looks at the camera and goes, you know what that means? That means that George W. Bush is watching Fox, and he's getting his legal advice from Judge Napolitano. And the rest, for better or for worse, is history. We do have a lot of fun in the work that we do. It's dreadfully serious. When people say to me, I see on Fox, I watch Fox all the time, I say to them, don't watch too much television. It's not good for you, whether you agree with the person on television or not. All right, from ridiculous experiences in the courtroom to profoundly serious ones. Some men say the earth is flat, and some men say it is round. But if it is flat, could a law of Parliament make it round? And if it is round, could the king's command flatten it? Those words were used by St. Thomas More in his own defense in arguing before a jury in his trial for high treason. The alleged act of treason was his refusal to acknowledge that the king was the head of the church on earth. We all know what happened. He lost the case and he lost his head. But when he was appealing to the jurors' common sense, of course Parliament couldn't make a flat earth round, and of course the king couldn't make a round earth flat. He was also appealing to their understanding of the natural law, of the order of things, of the way the good Lord created the earth, and of the limits on governments. Moore was arguing that the king is not omnipotent, and Parliament is not omnipotent, and that the laws of nature which give us life and which give us liberty at the same time impose natural restraints on the government. The argument had been made a couple thousand years before by Aristotle, and then by Augustine, and then by St. Thomas Aquinas, and it would be picked up by John Locke and eventually by Thomas Jefferson. It was crystallized by Jefferson when he wrote the most famous lines in the Declaration of Independence, that all men are created equal and endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, and that among these is life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. I emphasize by their Creator because Jefferson wove into the fabric of America at its birth the idea that our rights come from our humanity and not from the government, that our rights are gifts by virtue of our birth, that our rights are as natural to us as the fingers on the ends of our hands and the nose in the middle of our faces. And no parliament or king in 1776, we were still governed by a parliament or a king, could alter that. Well, the parliament and the king that governed us in 1776 had ingenious ways of raising money. Governments do. Sometimes they sit right on the board of your bank and monitor everything the bank does. Sometimes they read the notes that your doctor writes into his laptop computer so it knows what you tell the doctor and the doctor tells you. Of course, the world was not that sophisticated or intrusive in 1776, but the colonists were suffering from an abomination called the Stamp Act. And the Stamp Act was a revenue-raising legislation enacted by the British Parliament, which required all those in the colonies, not in Great Britain because there would have been a civil war, but in the colonies, to have an image of the king, a stamp with the king's face on it, on every piece of paper in your possession, every book, every pamphlet, every mortgage, every bank draft, even a poster you were going to nail to a tree had to have the king's image on it. You think it's trouble dealing with the post office today. You had to go to a British post office, a foreign post office, get online and buy an image of the stamp, an image of the king on the stamp. Question: how did the king know if every piece of paper in your possession had his image on it? Answer: Parliament enacted an abomination called the Townshend Acts, and the Townshend Acts authorized British soldiers to write their own search warrants. So a British soldier would knock at your door and very politely hand you a piece of paper on which he had authorized himself and those with him to enter upon your home, your private property, ostensibly to look for the stamps. Of course, while there, they may help themselves to alcohol, they might help themselves to furniture, they might even help themselves to the house, which is why we have the Third Amendment to the Constitution that prohibits the quartering of troops in private homes absent the express consent of the owner of the home. This was the last straw, the Stamp Act and the Townshend Acts. It was particularly offensive to colonists that the Parliament authorized British soldiers to write their own search warrants here, but as I said, not in Great Britain, where there would have been a civil war had the king tried to do that. What did we do? We fought a revolution. We fought a revolution against the mightiest army and the grandest navy and the most regal king on the planet. We won the revolution. We wrote a constitution. In writing the Constitution, we assured ourselves, we thought, that the government we created here would never do to us what the king and the Parliament had been doing to the colonists. So in 1787, in secret, in a hot and steamy summer in Philadelphia, the Constitutional Convention meets to debate the future of America and decide what kind of a government do we want here. We had 13 independent and sovereign states. That's what they were when they declared war and then declared victory over the king on the island 3,000 miles away that had been ruling us. So the 13 independent states, of which, of course, Louisiana was not yet one, attempted to come together as a government. First question: where do our rights come from? This is the first debate that they have in Philadelphia. This is Thomas More and St. Augustine and Aristotle and St. Thomas Aquinas and John Locke all over again. There's a big government crowd even in Philadelphia in 1787, led by Alexander Hamilton and John Adams, and that big government crowd says, well, without the government, there can be no rights because the government protects your rights, and therefore our rights come from the government. And because rights come from the government, in bad times when things are tough, the government can restrict those rights. And in good times when things are easy, the government can expand those rights. Madison made the Jefferson argument. Jefferson wasn't in Philadelphia. There was a form of government under the Articles of Confederation, and he was the ambassador to Paris. But Madison makes the Jefferson, Thomas More, Augustine, Aquinas, Aristotle argument, which is that our rights come from our humanity. And as the government didn't give them to us, the government can't take them away. That the rights are natural to us, whether you believe that we are created by the uncaused cause, a living, thinking Almighty, as I do, and as I suspect most of you do, or whether you think we are the product of nature and we are unique in all of nature because we're the only animals that can reason. From either argument, you derive the Madisonian view that our rights come from our humanity. So the Constitution is written, and it empowers the government with limited authority, and then in the first 10 amendments, which come around 4 years later, the government is restricted. Everybody knows the first lines of the First Amendment. Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech. Why do I emphasize the word the? Because to the framers in 1787, the freedom of speech preceded the existence of the country. It wasn't some amorphous idea that we're going to create in the Western world. It was the attitude and understanding that the freedom of speech is a part of our humanity. So 10 years later, in the first administration of John Adams, it's now 1798, Congress enacts the most abominable piece of legislation that side of the Patriot Act, called the Alien and Sedition Acts. And the Alien and Sedition Acts were written because Congress feared the French. Oh, how the times have changed, that Congress would fear the French. But Congress was worried that France would start a war with the new country and that French agents would infiltrate the country and secretly pass themselves off as American citizens. So the Alien and Sedition Act says, if you want to come to America, you can come here, except if you're French. You have to reside here for 14 years before you can be a citizen. It also says, if you bring the government into disrepute by criticizing the president, the Congress, or the Supreme Court, you can be tried for a felony and subjected to 2 years in prison. Well, how could the same generation, indeed in some cases the same human beings who wrote, Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech, also write the Alien and Sedition Acts, which in fact did abridge the freedom of speech? And by the way, in that litany of people that it was a crime to criticize, one person was missing, the vice president. Who was John Adams' vice president? Thomas Jefferson. They hated each other. In those days, everybody ran for president. Imagine this happening today. And whoever finished first became president, and whoever finished second became vice president. So Adams finished first in 1798, and Jefferson finished second. Jefferson said, I don't want the Alien and Sedition Acts, and by the way, if I ever become president, I'll never enforce them. We know what happened. He became president. The Alien and Sedition Acts expired. John Adams was known for his pomposity, and he at times wore military uniforms and a regal piece of headgear that vaguely resembled the crown of the British monarch. And a congressman, Matthew Lyons from Virginia, who was a Jeffersonian, anti-federalist, small government, the states ceded power to the federal government and not the other way around, referred to the president by his, as a phrase the president didn't like, his rotundity. John Adams had a problem with his waistline. This was all that Mrs. Adams could stand, and she wanted Congressman Lyons prosecuted for violating the Alien and Sedition Acts for making fun of the president's waistline. And so the Justice Department indicted Congressman Lyons, and he was tried in Boston. It was the only federal court in New England at the time, and he was convicted of violating the Alien and Sedition Acts, and he went to jail. And so sat in a western Massachusetts jail was a sitting member of the United States Congress because he made fun of the president's belly. All right, now, if you're from New Orleans, as maybe some of you are, if you're from Hudson County, New Jersey, if you're from Boston, or if you're from Chicago, you will understand the second half of this story. Congressman Lyons ran for re-election from his jail cell and won. He got reelected to Congress while he was in his jail cell. And of course, it was the same election in which Jefferson was elected president. Jefferson pardoned him. He got out of jail and he went back to Congress. We can laugh at these things because they are humorous looking at them 200 years later. But they are also profound because they set the government on a path to violating its own laws, to violating the basic principles that it held dear. If the First Amendment means anything, it means what it says, which is that Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech. We're not talking about hate speech, and we're not talking about fire in a theater, and we're not talking about pornography. We're talking about public speech impugning the government, questioning the personnel and the policies of the government. That is the heart of free speech, and it's the essence of what the First Amendment was intended to protect. And the Third United States Congress, which is the first one under John Adams' administration, Washington serving 2 terms. The Third United States Congress enacted this legislation. It expired in Jefferson's years. Can we draw a lesson from this? Well, we can draw a lesson after we look at a few more examples, but you'll see the lesson coming, which is that the government breaks its own laws, thinks it can regulate any behavior, thinks it can right any wrong, thinks it can tax any event for the greater good. And the greater good is whatever the government thinks will provide it with financial and electoral support. During the Civil War, Abraham Lincoln arrested about 15,000 people. These were not soldiers who were shooting at his. These were journalists. This was the entire legislature and its staff of the state of Maryland. These were newspaper editors and reporters who had been criticizing the war effort in the North. These were not people with guns shooting at the government. These were people using the freedom of speech guaranteed by the First Amendment from assault by the federal government, and they were locked up in jail, and they were denied the writ of habeas corpus, which means they weren't permitted to see charges against them, and they weren't permitted to go before a neutral judge, and they weren't permitted to challenge the government's confinement of them. This lasted, of course, for the duration of the Civil War. In 1866, after Lincoln was dead, a unanimous Supreme Court, 7 of whose 9 members Lincoln himself had just appointed, invalidated all of these incarcerations and said the president can't do this. In fact, nobody can do it. The Constitution was written to restrain the government in good times and in bad, and it applies in war and in peace, and it affects the people who run the government and the people that the government governs. Fast forward to 1917. We're at the outset of World War I, and a Eastern European Jewish immigrant by the name of Abe Gitlow is not happy with the voices leading us toward war. And Abe goes into the basement of his tenement building, and he finds a mimeograph machine. Are any of you old enough to remember that? An old-fashioned barrel drum with ink in it. You put a stencil on the outside, and if you turned it at just the right speed, the ink would seep through the stencil and it would catch the paper. The kids today don't know the difficulty that we had in producing pamphlets when we were kids. And you could produce a crude reproduction of what you had cut on the stencil. Abe's stencil said, if you're drafted, don't go. If you work in a munitions plant, stay home, because we don't belong in this war and it has nothing to do with us. He took these leaflets and he threw them from the roof of his tenement on the Lower East Side of Manhattan. And a federal agent found one of them. Fast forward 2 years, Abe is prosecuted for violating the Espionage Act, which makes it a crime to criticize the government when it is fighting a war. Imagine that today. I wouldn't be here. I'd be in jail if it were a crime to criticize the government when it's fighting a war. Declared or undeclared, lawful or unlawful, when the government fights a war, it was a crime to criticize it. By the way, the Espionage Act is still a law. The Alien and Sedition Acts are gone. Lincoln's butchering of the Constitution was invalidated by his own Supreme Court a year after his death. But the Espionage Act is still the law. When the New York Times revealed that President Bush had been using the 5 major telecoms to spy on people a couple of weeks after he denied it, and without warrants from judges, then Attorney General Alberto Gonzales threatened to prosecute the New York Times under the Espionage Act. Abe Gitlow is tried and is convicted. At his trial, the government couldn't find anybody except the federal agent who read or understood the leaflet. When the federal agent was asked on the witness stand if he knew what the leaflet said, he replied, I don't know, because I can't read Yiddish. These pamphlets weren't even written in a language that the public could understand. Mr. Gitlow died 15 years later in a federal prison. The Supreme Court upheld the conviction. World War II, FDR incarcerates people on the basis of their ancestry, not the place of their birth, but their ancestry. If you were a Japanese American, you're automatically suspect, and so you must be locked up, 110,000 of them. 1988, a Republican president, Ronald Reagan, and a Democratic Congress would enact the Civil Liberties Act of 1988, which would condemn the wartime incarceration of people based on race and ethnicity, compensate them, those still living, for the time that they spent in these prison camps in the western part of the United States, and vow that this would never be the public policy of the United States of America again. So we begin to see a pattern, and the pattern is presidents at war, government at war. When the government is at war, it wants to act like it's a big godfather to all of us and will take care of us. I can hear the government like the devil coming from out behind a tree and whispering, give me your freedom and I'll keep you safe. And that's essentially what the government argues. Yesterday I was interrogating Congressman Charlie Rangel. What a character he is. He's a liberal, progressive. He is what he is. I was interrogating him about the war in Libya. I said, where are the Democrats? Where's the left? Where are the people who condemned George Bush for the invasion of Iraq and invasion of Afghanistan? I condemned the invasion of Iraq and the invasion of Afghanistan because these were illegal wars that the Congress didn't declare. The Constitution says only the Congress can declare war. Where are the Democrats, Charlie? Why are they silent? Is it because they hate Gaddafi and they want the president to kill him? No, it's because they like the president. It's because they'll give him one. Give him one! What is more dangerous for a president to do than to send troops into harm's way without an authorization from the Congress? When the president sends the military to fight a war and doesn't have a declaration of war from the Congress, when instead he talks to a bunch of Arab dictators in Egypt called the Arab League, a bunch of pointy heads on the Upper East Side of Manhattan called the United Nations Security Council, and a bunch of one-worlders in Belgium called NATO, and doesn't consult the Congress likes the president and wants to give him one. When the president does that, then the military has become just the personal military of the president. And the founders assured that this wouldn't happen because they wrote in the Constitution, Congress shall declare war, so that there is a debate, so that there's a broad national consensus, so that there's a target, so that there's an end goal. But at least George Bush consulted the Congress on Iraq and Afghanistan. It wasn't a declaration of war. It was some amorphous thing called an authorization to use military force, which basically said to President Bush and all of his successors, because this is still the law as well, go kill whoever you want, as long as the person you're killing is a serious threat to the national security of the United States. Is Libya a threat to the national security of the United States? No, it's not. Even if they turned off the oil, it wouldn't be a threat to the national security of the United States. Has Libya attacked us? No. Has Libya threatened us? No. Is this war legal? Absolutely not. Is it constitutional? No way is this constitutional. Do you think it's a coincidence that the president began to bomb Libya when he was in Brazil and the Congress was on spring break? By the way, I thought spring break was for college kids in Fort Lauderdale. Did you know that the Congress takes a spring break? Well, it does. And the president knows that as well, and that's when he dropped the bomb, saying there wasn't time to consult the Congress. Of course, we now know that he signed papers 3 weeks earlier authorizing CIA agents and special ops military, the so-called boots on the ground that he claimed would never occur, to violate the sovereignty of Libya and enter the country. Do you like going to your doctor? Do you like the privacy that you have with your doctor? Do you like the freedom that you have to make decisions with your doctor without intrusion by the federal government? All of that will go. Do you like the privacy that you have with your banker? Do you like the banker's ability to assess your net worth and your needs and your reliability as a lender without intrusion by a federal bureaucrat? That freedom will go. Do you like going to the dentist and learning that it's going to cost about $5,000 for the braces and agreeing to pay the dentist $1,000 every 3 months without the intrusion of a federal bureaucrat? All of that will go. Because under President Obama and the Democrats, your relationship to any financial institution and your relationship to any health care provider has been changed so as to impose the intrusion of a federal bureaucrat in every major decision-making there is. If 5 of you in this room take $100,000 and give it to Fenstermacher and say, we trust you, invest it, throw your own $100,000 in, shouldn't the 5 of you be able to do that and bear the risk yourselves? No longer. Fenstermacher would have to report what he did and get the permission of a federal bureaucrat. What about the clause of the Constitution, which says that if the Congress wants your life, your liberty, or your property, it can't just take it, it has to sue you for it? Well, the Congress doesn't like to enforce that clause. What about the clause of the Constitution called the Contracts Clause? The government can't interfere with freely negotiated for contracts, voluntary agreements between two people. Well, the Congress doesn't like that one either. All of these intrusions into our economic liberties and our civil liberties today have antecedents. And I've described some of the more horrific of those antecedents. And every time the government does something in which it goes outside the confines of the Constitution, it looks to examples like the Alien and Sedition Acts, or Lincoln in the Civil War, or Woodrow Wilson in World War I, or FDR in World War II. And future presidents will look at President Obama bombing Libya. Who knows where this is going to end up? The last time we started out bombing and as advisors, it was the Vietnam War, which cost us 50,000 lives and over 500,000 human beings rotating in and through Vietnam, and the bad guys won anyway. All right, you're home one night and there's a knock at the door. And you come to the door and you open it and there's a guy with a gun. Look at him. He says, "Give me your money. I want to give it away in your name." Yourself, what kind of a crackpot is this? He wants to take my money and give it away in my name. You call the police. You find out he is the police. He's a federal agent come to collect your taxes. Now, if you wouldn't let a thug take your money and give it away, if you wouldn't let your neighbors take your money and give it away, why do we let the government take our money and give it away, whether it's in our names or in the government's name? Charity comes from the heart. It is impossible to be charitable with someone else's money. You can only be charitable with your own. But the government thinks it knows what's better for us than what we know for ourselves. Social Security broke. Medicare broke. Medicaid broke. The post office broke. Amtrak broke. When the government took over the Mustang Ranch because it couldn't pay its taxes, they ran that into the ground. So let me get this straight. The government can't provide booze and hookers to truckers in the desert, and they want to micromanage your health care. All right, I'll give you a little break from this gloom and doom. About a year ago, the Yankees are playing the Mets, and it's a big deal in New York. They play 12 games each. This was the 12th game. The Mets had won 6. The Yankees had won 5. It was in Yankee Stadium. And I get a call from O'Reilly's assistant saying, "Hey, Judge, Bill has an extra ticket to the Met game Friday night. He'd like you to join him." I thought to myself, who the heck wants to spend a Friday night with O'Reilly? So I said to her, "You know, I can't make it Friday night, but I know somebody who can." It was my then radio partner, Brian Kilmeade, who's a Fox Sports guy. And I tell Kilmeade, I tell O'Reilly's assistant, Kilmeade's happy, she gives him the ticket, they get in O'Reilly's limo, they go up to Yankee Stadium, they have a lovely dinner. There are 5-star restaurants inside the stadium these days, and they watch the game. Now, in this game, the Mets are winning the whole game. It's the bottom of the 9th. The score is 3-2 Mets. Bases are loaded, 2 outs. Derek Jeter is up for the Yankees, hits a routine fly ball into the infield. The shortstop, Luis Castillo, pushes everybody away, goes to catch the ball, drops the ball. 2 guys score, the Yankees win, the place goes crazy. This is a big deal in New York because a new phrase enters the New York vocabulary called pull a Castillo, which means do the opposite of what you are extremely well paid to do. In other words, drop the ball. So Monday morning, I see Kilmeade. I go, my God, what an unbelievable ending to the game. I know that you and O'Reilly are Met fans. How did you react when Castillo dropped the ball? We didn't see him drop the ball. But what the heck were you doing? How could you have missed the most dramatic moment in New York sports? We left the game a little early. O'Reilly was getting a little bored. I said, well, where the heck were you when Castillo dropped the ball? Oh, we were still in his limo on our way home, listening to the radio. Oh, well, what was your reaction when you were listening to the radio in the limo and Castillo dropped the ball? Oh, we weren't listening to the Yankee game. All right, Brian, what were you listening to on the radio at midnight on a Friday night when Castillo dropped the ball? A rerun of the O'Reilly Factor. You cannot make this stuff up. My show on Fox Business is called Freedom Watch because I refer to myself as a simple night watchman, watching the government when it steals your liberty and when it steals your property. and we all know how it steals and how it gets away with it. Why is it that if the government derives its just powers from the consent of the governed, that it can do things that we can't? How can the government coerce a bank into taking a loan that the bank doesn't want to receive from the government by threatening to sick the FDIC on the bank and audit it, an audit that would cost the bank millions in shareholder equity and in the time value of employees to comply with the audit? Why is it that the government thinks it can break its own laws in order to enforce its laws? Why is it that presidents think they can bomb and kill? Why is it that people who are sworn to preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution will look the other way? I think we're all inflicted with libido. Well, not that kind of libido, but something Augustine called libido dominandi, which is the lust to dominate. The lust to get into the government and tell other people how to live their lives. The lust that the government knows what's better for us than what we want to do for ourselves. But the whole purpose of the American experiment, the very reason we are here today, is the opposite of that. I mean, we fought this war against the king and the parliament and their armies and navies to demonstrate that the individual is greater than the state, that the individual has an immortal soul, that government is not logic or reason, it's force, it's a fire, it's a dangerous fire which will consume us if we don't restrain it. And the Constitution was written to put in safeguards to assure that we could restrain the government. And every single time we look the other way, whether it's laughing that Congressman Lyons was incarcerated because he made fun of the president's waistline, or whether it's Charlie Rangel saying, well, we're giving a president a pass on killing Libyans because we like him and we like the other things he's doing. Every time we do that, every time we permit the president to do things that he's not authorized to do, and the Congress to regulate behavior that is immune from regulation under the Constitution, we lose liberty and we lose property, and we create a precedent for future generations. How are we going to pay off $14.3 trillion in debt? Well, how about starting by not going deeper into debt? I mean, that's economics 101, Mr. President. He thinks we can pay off the debt by getting deeper into debt. He thinks you can solve a problem caused by too much borrowing and spending with more borrowing and spending. You live with this in your lives every day. I live with it because I watch it and explain it for a living for my bosses at Fox. You live with it, but you really have your assets and your livelihoods exposed to an avaricious government that wants to be in your boardroom or in the doctor's office with you, or even in the post office, since the government can now read our mail before we get it, or even at your computer, since the government can now capture every keystroke on the computer without a search warrant. Well, how the heck can the government do that? Remember the Townsend Acts? Remember how we fought a revolution over a government that authorized British soldiers to write their own search warrants? You see, the Patriot Act, enacted in the hysteria following 9/11, permits federal agents to write their own search warrants. So your medical records, your financial records, your computer records, your telephone records, even your mail can be examined by federal agents on their own. We come a full 360 degrees, my friends, from fighting a war against a government, the last straw of whose imposition upon us was agents writing their own search warrants, to electing representatives, senators, and members of Congress who would authorize the government's agents to do the same thing to us that the king's soldiers did to the colonists. So in every day, in every way, we all have to be aware of this. We all have to know what the government is up to and stop it at every turn. I am happy that you're here. You're here because the government wants to take your money and the government wants to take your freedom. Let's just be honest about it. Whether it's like that story I told with the guy with the gun because they want to give it away or because they want to use it for some sort of an experiment. The legion of the litany of government wasting money is well known and known to all of you. Only fidelity to the Constitution will save us. Only a return to first principles will save us. The individual is greater than the state. The people are entitled to a government that stays within the confines of the Constitution. That government is best which governs least. The Constitution was written to keep the government off the people's backs. Those are the virtues for which our forefathers fought and which we must regain. My friends, it's been a great breakfast. I thank you for inviting me. God bless you.
We have a few minutes for some questions. If you have any questions that you'd like to ask, please write them down on the index card and I'll come pick them up.
Judge, there are a couple of questions from the audience, and one of them pertains to the health of this industry and horizontal fracking, which seems to be under attack by the President and the EPA potentially right now. Something in the news yesterday about in the next 90 days a report coming back from to the President that can stop this. Is this something that you talk about constitutionality, you talk about the legislative side and the administrative side of government? Can they actually do this, or will they?
The question inquires about the ability of the Environmental Protection Administration to impose regulations upon the oil and gas industry which could never have enough popular support to be enacted by the Congress. Well, this is a defect in the system, and this goes back to the Nixon administration when the EPA was enacted, and the administration of George H.W. Bush, in which the EPA was granted broad discretionary authority. And when these regulations are challenged by the Supreme Court basically says two things. The Antonin Scalia part of the court says, delegated authority cannot be delegated away. So if the Constitution delegates to Congress the authority to regulate interstate commerce, the Congress can't give that authority away to some administrative agency. Unfortunately, Justice Scalia's argument has never prevailed. The other argument is that Congress lacks the intelligence, well, we all know that, but Congress lacks the ability to understand various industries, so it delegates away the regulation of those industries, the FDA to the pharmaceutical industry, the EPA to you folks, and Congress can do that. Regrettably, that's the law as it now stands, and regrettably, the EPA can lawfully enact regulations that the Congress itself would never have the political fortitude to enact. And the challenge to the EPA is not, is the regulation good or bad, is not, does the regulation take away our property or our liberty, but did the EPA abuse its authority or violate a clause of the Constitution? That's a very difficult challenge to meet. So what must be done? The enabling legislation must be changed. The legislation which gives this discretion to unelected, unaccountable bureaucrats to regulate the daylights out of an industry that they don't understand. I mean, to think of it, you put a bunch of environmental zealots in the EPA, do you expect them to be fair to the oil and gas industry? They hate you. Why should they be fair to you? This is what we're confronted with today. So the legislation needs to be changed. The legislation that gives the discretion, the rulemaking authority to the EPA and to other administrative agencies needs to be changed.
What is your opinion on our government's investment of $2 billion in Brazil, incentivizing offshore production there, while there is a de facto moratorium in the Gulf of Mexico?
Wow. Well, I condemn that. I'll give you, in the interest of full disclosure, Marty Feldman is one of my closest friends. Marty Feldman is Judge Martin Feldman, United States District Court for the Eastern District of Louisiana, who had to hold federal officials in contempt of court because they refused to accept drilling permits as he twice ordered them to do. Even if Judge Feldman were not my friend, even if I didn't know him and had never heard of him, I would praise what he has done, and that is you don't shut down the whole Gulf of Mexico because of the tragedy in one little place. Even though it was a tragedy, there was nothing wrong with the other wells that were operative there. Look, this shows you the mindset of the president. Go ahead, Brazil, and you do what we won't let folks in our own country do. The more he does these things, the more I begin to think that he really is one of these one-worlder types who would prefer that the world were governed by the UN or by NATO than the country governed by free people, freely electing their members of Congress who are restrained by the Constitution. Obviously, the president is no friend to your industry, and obviously his administration is no friend to your industry, and what he said in Brazil just heightened and exemplified that.
What is your opinion of the Obama administration choosing not to defend the Defense of Marriage Act?
It's a complicated issue because the Obama administration came to a decision that it would lose in the courts. The law that's already there indicates that it would lose. So the question is, do you want the federal government wasting time and money on a losing effort? That's one side of the argument. The other side of the argument is that the president's obligation is to uphold the law, whether he agrees with the law or not, whether he likes the law or not, whether he would have voted for the law or not. Presidents throughout history have isolated laws that they don't like and didn't want to enforce. George Bush, in the very act of signing legislation that prohibited the federal government from reading your mail before you do without a search warrant, said, as he was signing it into law, I don't intend to enforce this law. So again, we have this history of presidents picking and choosing what laws they want to enforce and what laws they don't want to enforce, and they use the behavior of their predecessors as precedent for it. As a practical matter, there is very little one can do about this issue other than voting the president out of office, because in addition to being the commander-in-chief, he's also the chief federal law enforcement officer of the land. And if he tells the Justice Department, don't defend this law, there's no way you can force the Justice Department to defend it.
One final question. It's about the Chinese standing by, or will they stand by, in Libya because they developed the fields, the oil fields in eastern Libya. Do you have any opinion on that?
My opinion is that the president is unwisely sticking his nose into sticking his elbow into China's eye. There are 35,000 employees of one of the Chinese oil companies who fled Libya in the past 2 weeks, not because the rebels are going after Gaddafi, but because the Americans are bombing. I think that we irritate China at our peril, and I don't think the president understands this. Is it time for me to go?
Look, we appreciate everything.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Judge.
God bless you, Louisiana. Thank you.